arrived at Evergreen a year ago, a group of faculty and staff discussing diversity and equity asked me to help improve the college's work on these issues. And as I became involved, I learned about inequities in the experiences of our students that were outrageous. Particularly those experiences of our underrepresented and underserved students. And it became very clear to me that a council of faculty, dedicated faculty, staff, and students would be needed to tackle the problems of equity gaps in our students' experiences. And late last spring, I established and charged this equity council, this incredible equity council, with developing a plan for institutional change. Systemic change that would enable Evergreen to acknowledge and address the equity gaps that are pervasive on our campus.
It's really interesting because the equity gap movement that the scorecard thing led to was such a deficit focus, right? It's like who's not thriving became the crisis. Just so you understand a little bit more about the context, it's called the Equity and Inclusion Council. I think it's had 3 different names. I've been a part of this and a prior committee for 6 years and another DTF for 2 years before that. So I've been through a lot of iterations. And the groups will say, we're looking at multiple dimensions of diversity, right? We're looking at not just race, we're looking at ableism, we're looking at gender, we're looking at veteran status. We care about first-generation students at a low socioeconomic level, right? So they'll say a lot of things that apply to a lot more of our students, right? The dialogue always becomes foregrounded by race. It just goes there. And you're like, well, so this group is lower than the other group. And I'm like, actually, veterans are lower than that, or men are struggling more, but it's also really tricky anytime you have a room full of folks that are often recruited to these committees intentionally because of a particular agenda or a particular, particular expertise, maybe is a less politically charged word, but, both, I think, are in play. There's a way in which when I'm presenting an individual study and we can engage with it, it's different than when people with a plan and a charge want to focus only on the gaps. They're going to handpick out some of those gaps.
IR provided us with a wealth of data that told us a complete story of our work here on this campus. And once we looked into that data, we could not divert our gaze. At the end of the day, we came together and we devised a set of recommendations that we all could stand behind.
I don't think those recommendations very well match the data in some cases. And having been a part of the process, I will tell you that a lot of times the recommendations walked in the room from the very first kickoff meeting. And that then it became the burden of the data to try to for people to find some data to support what they believed. One of the examples was students of colors have poor retention. It walked in the room with people who walked in that room, and I said, that is a false statement. I don't know how many times I said that is a false statement.
There are things that we recommended that represented our best thinking at the time, that also represented the data that was in front of us. And now we need to say, what's our next step? And we do need to take a next step.
We admit 98% of our students. We do not then ever give any form of assessment or ching up of that student's skill level with a good placement in our curriculum, right? We can say, oh, welcome, but then fend for yourself. There are institutional questions about that sort of thing, but I will tell you that the weighted average analysis it helps to control for some of that noise. That is none of that mattered to the folks who walked in that room saying, students of color are less well retained. I'm like, actually, they've been within about a percentage as a group, right? Now they're talking about pooling all people of color together, right? As a group, they've been within about 1 percentage point of the retention of white non-Hispanic students for years here. There's hardly any gap, right? But people like to say it. They were attached to it. There were people who were attached to saying that even when I showed them data that said that's not the case.
Part of the thing that was challenging in all of this is this plan or this charge that we were given was highly complex. Thank you, George, very much. And we had to say, what is going to be a priority? So what we've offered up are recommendations for this academic year, because we realized that there was more work that we had to do. We had to take 20-something people and try to form a group. Y'all don't know how hard that is. Because you know what? On my regular job, I teach in MIT. Everybody here has a regular job. People worked beyond their capacity to do this work. They may not name it, but it needs to be in this room. So when you look at it, you think about all the hard work that went into the recommendations. And then you think about how you're going to enter into that conversation. Because again, this work on this campus and what we say we're about is student-centered. And if we can't be student-centered, then we should take that off our name. Our students are what this work is about.
So another key movement, it's not always just race-based retention and our failures as an institution rooted in historical racism that says that, which all of that is true. I don't mean to shrug that off. But that's not the only agenda that walks in. Another one is that there is still an ongoing conflict about what affirmative action means. And the problem is because people will come in and say, we need to hire more X. And you're like, actually, no. And it continues to play out. People can't quite let go of the notion. They don't want to be governed by that rule. Well, Evergreen should be different. I'm like, and jeopardize all future federal funding. Is that really how far you want to go here? I know myself and I know most people have more to keep learning because the world changes. You got to keep learning. And that we hope is happening. But that's professional development. It's not like who you hire. It's making sure that you're committed to continually improving how you serve your students and thinking about new nuances, right? So I think we can agree on that. When it came to the hiring, though, there are people who are like, we should be representational. We should be hiring intentionally, for example, Latino people because we have more Latino students, and it's illegal. There are 3 categories that we actually are holding ourselves accountable for: veteran status, disability, and race. And we can't hire to those, right? That's illegal. We can only monitor them or see if we have the kind of environment. You can do things like recruitment. You can recruit differently, advertise differently. You could create a better campus climate that was more welcoming, but you cannot make a hiring selection decision based on any of those criteria. Cannot. Illegal.
So the purpose of this exercise that we have to do that we're doing together right now is to use our good minds to seek to understand the goals. Seek to understand the goals. And to notice the questions that we have where it would help us to better understand the goals. You need to know that these goals are informed by the literature, by the data that we got learned from the students, by much conversation. These are not arbitrary goals. They are informed goals. And what we want you to do is to read them and make sense of them. This is a sense-making exercise. Read them, make sense of them. This is about playing the believing game. Name what's important and valuable about these goals. And for the places where you're like, I don't understand, or you have a knee-jerk reaction to question, ask the question, what would help you to understand how we landed on these goals? So I want to hear from you. What's your first task? Read. And what's your second? What are you reading for? You're seeking understanding and you're reading for what's valuable and important. Notice your questions.
Go to National Survey of Student Engagement. We are floundering in terms of political diversity interactions on our campus, for example, whereas we have strength in racial diversity interactions, we are floundering in terms of political. And by floundering, I mean it was poor and it's now poorer. We have a parallel on the alumni survey in which we set, again, an accreditation goal, improving the tolerance for different or opposing viewpoints on campus. And in fact, over the 4-year period that we've been measuring it, and we just hit our last measurement year, we have declined in alumni satisfaction with tolerance for opposing or different viewpoints. Are they perfect indicators? Not necessarily, but they get at that we have a much narrower range of political diversity than we do other kinds of diversity. If you know that you have 85% hyper liberals and you're teaching about veterinary care. So how are you going to help for educational reasons, right? And also obviously for the support of the few students that are over on the other end of the continuum. I want to support them too. But also I think for the academic outcome, it makes no sense for us not to be challenged by an alternative perspective. I think there's even a data case to be like, okay, guys, not only is this a struggle for us, this is something we're actually getting worse at. Over the last 2 years, our scores all went down. And that means there are students here who are really not experiencing diverse perspectives in the classroom is one of them, right? But the other is, are you finding your classrooms tolerant of something outside of or opposing viewpoints? Are you finding room for these to be expressed? And if both pieces are dropping, like, so that's both sort of the material that we're choosing to put in our programs, the sources, the information, the ideas, and the acceptance of those ideas, or should they be raised through a different source, the acceptance and tolerance of opposing views.
So I appreciate President Bridges' comments about this work will take time, but the time is now. These are doable acts. We know that there's more work to be done, and we need many more hands to do this work because we need to share the labor. I cannot speak to the emotional and painful experience of this work has been as a woman of color. I could have chose not to do it, and I could have chose to stay in my silo in MIT. But I chose, once I saw the data, to say, I cannot look away. We must not look away.
Asian students significantly less satisfied with tolerance and acceptance of opposing views. And it was interesting how even if you say that and point to it and say it and point to it, the people are like, yeah. Let's get back to this other issue. If I am a super conservative student at Evergreen, every political conversation I have is going to be across difference. It was also interesting how quickly that data gets dismissed by some audiences. I mean, not by everyone, but, Asian students are less satisfied. And then they'd be like, but it's Black students who are having a hard time in seminar. I'm like, did you see this data? It is not Black students. It is first-generation students. The vast majority of first-generation students at Evergreen are white. The vast majority. There are in-state, lower-income white residents. That's actually most of them. I'm not exclusively. Yes, we have first-generation students of color. Yes, we have out-of-state first-gen students. But, I mean, that the first-gen population is really heavily dominated by in-state white resident students, like from Washington, for whom we're the cheapest public college. A lot of families put a lot of stock in sending that first generation to school. And then we run our other risks of like, does our curriculum actually support you in the kind of goals you want? And do we kind of honor our promises or set you up and then suddenly stop offering that program? Bigger equity questions for me have to do with that right now, as far as like where my heart of this work is. But boy, it's taking a lot of time, I'll tell you.
And so we encourage you to offer feedback, but when you look at that plan, go to that heat map that's been linked, and I dare you to divert your gaze, because you won't be able to do it. So we invite you. We want more conversation, and we know there's much more work to be done. We invite that conversation. But if you want to be an obstructionist, work on your own, because we don't have time for it.
People want to do something, right? They want to take action. They want to do something. But to also have permission to critique, like there's a lot of rigidity around the engagement with this, not just the document, but with the initiatives. Seems like there's a fear of critique. There's a party line in the committee. Like questioning the plan was met with you're on board. I mean, even within the group, there should be room for us to say, look, we're all committed to this. The fact that we have slightly different perspectives on how to move forward shouldn't be a threat, right? It could be a strength. So there's a dominant culture regardless, right? Regardless of the actual ends that you might discover underneath it, like what's going on, like the actual distribution, there's still a dominant political correct culture, if you will. Why would you be like, well, I voted for Trump? Like, would I say that in a room full of people? And even if I had an interesting rationale about healthcare or about, it's not about him, it's about what I think for the pendulum to swing. Because there are people who think it's time to force the question. I've heard different things, but you have to talk to people very individually. You're not going to see any of that on the big forum announcements and stuff. You got to find people who are courageous enough to just want to tell you what's on their mind and It's usually on a one-on-one basis. Even if there is more political diversity here than we even presume, there's a normative. It's why it's okay to say, well, that person's clearly a bad fit. They used to work for the Department of Defense. The fact that we would believe that was okay to say in a room tells me there's a dominant culture. There's such a fear in saying that we're doing well at some things. In some cases, our gaps are so much smaller than the national norms, and no one even wants to talk about it. Guys, we have the National Student Retention Data Exchange data that says we may be disappointed in ourselves that African American and Native American students are not persisting as well towards graduation. But do you know how big that gap is in other schools? It's, blasphemy to say such a thing. We are doing something to counter historical norms. But that in and of itself is taboo right now in the climate that we're in.
I was going to say, I don't understand how the diversity and equity plan was presented as this thing that people had to get on board with at this campus if you got paid by this campus, and then then it's turned around and then you get to send out all these emails about it. Because it was presented like that at the meeting, as if you don't have a choice because this is the new direction that Evergreen is moving to. And those were literally the word for word words that were used, was that you have no choice in this plan. You're either going to get on board or you're going to get left behind. And so I don't understand why it was even acceptable to be sending the emails in the first place if there was no choice. And so that to me feels like mistrust in the way that you said the equity plan would be used, and the way that the people that sit on the equity plan felt like it should be used, and the way that the campus blew this whole equity plan up as if it was going to be this great thing to turn around and allow people to then use it as a weapon in the way that Brett did. It just doesn't make sense to me why he's still here if this was something you had to get on board with.
I don't mean to put my hands up to silence you. That's not my purpose. It's a sign of my utter frustration and the challenges that we have in every organization. There are going to be a handful of people who are just going to tell us all to fuck off. Please don't put that down in the video. I'm going to get fired for that. Okay.
Trust me, if people don't get fired for 15 years of what was that word, Ken? Patterns? You're not
President, the average life expectancy of a college president is 4.5 years.
So you're at halfway.
I'm at halfway, but statements like that might make my lifespan much shorter.